Hello, everybody. Welcome to this episode of Hidden History. My name is Spencer Walsh, and on today's episode, we're talking Russia. One of the most interesting countries, obviously, from the transition from the Soviet Union period to capitalism and today. But today we're talking about that transition period. That's right, one of the most remarkable economic transformations over a short period of time. The ultimate win, the ultimate victory for Western ideology, Western political and social power, and Western might in general. Communism over, capitalism victorious. So why did it lead to one of the most rapid expanses in human suffering and economic misery we've seen in modern times, especially over such a short period of time and in a circumstance where there was no active war going on? In fact, one had just ended. That's right, ladies and gentlemen. Today we're talking about shock therapy, the program that Russia went through in the transition period from the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991 till really about 2000, when a certain familiar face took over the reins of that very historically interesting, shall we say, country. All right, let's get into it, guys. Today, thank you again so much for joining us. Really excited about this topic because, again, as we know, Russia is a land of contrast. A lot of crazy things, a lot of powerful forces. If you listen to the recent Newsflash episode with James Weld, I thought he made a really interesting point. You know, Russia has always had top-down control, whether it be Tsar, whether it be someone like Stalin, whether it be someone like Putin today. But pretty much all of these major changes has happened through, obviously Tsar's going back to for quite a while, but pretty much all of the major changes, all of the wheels-turning historical events have happened by people, whether it be the Bloody Sunday incident in the early 1910s, or whether it be many people out on the streets, throughout the Soviet Union period, up at the Berlin Wall. A lot of this change has happened through the people. This has been through voices coming out, through really distinctive, brutal rebellion, and that is a little bit different to this because, as you're going to discuss, it really wasn't as democratic as a lot of people in the West made it out to be. Russia is a kind of a country that we obsess over, and we've talked a lot about the lead up to the fall of Russia, but we really don't talk that much about the aftermath. We should talk about it, sure, what happened in the world after the end of the Cold War, but we really don't talk about what happened in Russia. When it comes down to it, it was really an incredibly, to put it mildly here, unstable environment that was made largely by Western forces, which were largely controlled by the United States, their government, and their major corporations. It decimated any possibility of popular institutions and paved the way for the rise of Putin and the authoritarian climate he brought about, condemning Russians to many more years, still undefined more years, of suffering. This was about the utter collapse and failure of one way of life, social and political and economic triumph over communism, and the complete triumph of capitalism as a world order. The USSR had lost, and the Russian people would pay the price. The people that they would pay the price to, though, I don't want to spoil it. We're going to get into it. Anyway, so they forced Russia open through the shelling of a parliament building that destroyed young democracy, brutal economic policies, and a Pizza Hut commercial. This was what we call liberal shock therapy. This narrative of utter collapse was really kind of celebrated by the U.S. We got the fall of the wall, the triumph of ideals, the winning of democracy, the winning of the Cold War. We've done it, ladies and gentlemen. But the aftermath is one of the blurrier parts of history. We know Russia, quote-unquote, democratized and got where they are today, but we don't know how they got into it because it doesn't fit into our narrative. It's not taught in schools, shock therapy. Although I did learn about glasnost and perestroika in high school. I didn't learn about shock therapy and what happened after. Because, again, it doesn't fit into that American narrative. It's something that we've talked about so many times on the show. It's this in hidden history, especially because it goes throughout hidden history as this kind of explained justification for why Americans and American leaders and Western leaders do a lot of things, because they view themselves as kind of the ultimate source of good, the people with all the right ideas, the people with all the right morals and virtues, and they believe they should be the ones to impose it on people. And when they oftentimes do, they kind of pat themselves on the back. They say, look at us, look at what we did. And let's not really go over any of the more kind of gruesome stuff. We're only going to go over the parts where everyone was massively economically successful. Everyone got a job. It was all good. It was all perfect. Well, for a lot of people in Russia, this just was not the case. What did happen was a massive political violence period, a lack of democracy, and immediate misery for millions. As Russia went through shock therapy, the transition from communist to capitalist, politics really began to include some privatizations, the end of price controls, opening to foreign investment, and austerity politics. It is kind of a euphemistic term because it belies the long-lasting effect it's had on the country. This went on for years. It's kind of this kind of misleading term where it's like, it's just going to be a big shock. It'll kind of hurt a little bit. We're just ripping off the Band-Aid of those crazy communists. But, your life expectancy should rebound over a certain period of time. That really, as we'll see, just didn't happen. The American leaders instead saw their opportunity for massive profit, and so did the Russians. But the American leaders also, and you can kind of point to where this may sound a little bit familiar in today's news, as well as try and bring it back to today's news, to kind of try and help you better understand what's going on in the world today. The Americans really also saw an opportunity to gain complete and total control over a force that had once been one of their most threatening adversaries. Again, using other people to gain control over a geopolitical adversary and pushing things to a pretty dangerous level. Again, where does that sound familiar today? I couldn't say it personally. It's up to you to think. Again, you probably heard of this glasnost and perestroika policies. These were liberalization policies for the Soviet Union under Mikhail Gorbachev, who was the last premier of the USSR. You get some quick terms here, because again, a lot of Americans struggle with this kind of history and this kind of denomination. The situation with the USSR is as follows. The USSR is a big confederation of countries, all kind of coming together, all bound by the Soviets. They're all communists. You got Yugoslavia, you got Belarus, you got Ukraine, all those kind of Eastern European countries that split up after the Soviet Union, Lithuania, Latvia, all that kind of thing, all those kind of Cyrillic-using Slavic countries. And Russia, at the time, was obviously the biggest, the kind of central force in that area. But they were really much still a union, and Gorbachev was at the head of the union, all the while with Boris Yeltsin being in charge in Russia as the leader of Russia in that federation. But these policies, these liberalization policies, seem to be going pretty well. The union would not be as authoritarian as it was under Stalin, but it would still continue relatively with the same broader policy structure. But Boris Yeltsin, surprisingly to a lot of Soviet Union citizens, was working on a treaty signature with Ukraine and Belarus that really broke open the union. The main Soviet in Moscow, I believe it's called the Super Soviet, they voted to dissolve in the end of 1991. And for a period of time, it was the Russian Federation that was in charge. So Gorbachev's resignation was really a shock to the Soviet Union, to many people on the ground, who thought they were simply getting a more liberalized Soviet Union with a lot of the same policy structures attached. And this was something, this vision had 80% support in a referendum that was passed in the Gorbachev era. And it was a real kind of big surprise for a lot of people to say, especially in these countries, these outer countries, which also received pretty strong majorities for the continuation of the Union along more liberal lines. It was obviously a pretty big shock for them to be like, hey, now we're our own independent country. We're not part of the Soviet Union anymore. This is a big, big deal. I don't really know how to come to terms with this, or whatever they were thinking at the time. I could only imagine what they were thinking at the time. But yeah, now Russia was its own nation, untied with the other Soviet Union countries, with Yeltsin in charge. With the shock of the Soviet Union dissolution, Yeltsin, who had some other ties, shall we say, some long-standing ties to anti-Russian forces or anti-Soviet forces and Russian nationalistic forces, and most importantly the West, began to use this shock, this chaotic scene at the end of 1991 to open the floodgates to capitalist investment. We saw the IMF come in, people like Jeffrey Sachs, 1 month after the Soviet Union dissolution, and just pretty much instant transition from the command economy, the really all-encompassing totalizing command economy and totalitarian command economy of the Soviet Union. It was almost complete capitalism. A lot of these reforms were in privatizations happened incredibly fast. And 1 month after the Soviet Union's dissolution, all price controls on goods were dropped, and the basic cost of goods rose 250%. Because again, we don't have to really worry about profits. You don't have to really worry about always using the price, changing prices. So this market that was fundamentally untouched for a number of decades now went right back into kind of 1990s level, relatively modern capitalist market. On the tier of all the other kind of 1990s, very modern, very advanced kind of capitalistic markets, and because of that, they were able to really find the cost of basic goods rose a shocking 250% because of this removal of price controls. This obviously triggered hyperinflation and in turn mass layoffs. The unemployment increased 56% in the transition period. And the GDP not was 56%, increased by 56%. The GDP declined by 14.5% in a single year. And hey, you thought communists and Soviets were inefficient, didn't want to work, didn't want to produce. Well, 20% industrial production decline in 1 year after the Soviet Union, which is pretty shocking and kind of gives, even though the Soviet industrial policy and economic policy towards the end was an absolute mess, this was unambiguously, statistically worse. And it's not like they couldn't have a kind of much more managed tradition to a pretty strong social democracy. Largely, and again, probably the key takeaway is this was a political decision. Yeltsin, the West, come in, team up. They say, we have to do this now, and we have to do this as soon as possible. Why? Because they wanted to extract the maximum amount of profit. There was so many of these companies to privatize. There is so much untapped, unextracted wealth. Who cares about what the Russian people, how they would live, what they would think, how they would feel? It was most important for these people to do it by any means necessary. This all comes again in a backdrop as all this stuff was happening. Inflation increased by 1,354%. Real incomes were cut in half, and the government slashed spending on health and education over the transition period as well. To put in perspective, COVID, something that killed 1 million people all around the world, more than 1 million, caused a life expectancy drop of 1 year. In about, the 2 years or so COVID was really going on. This Russian transition period caused Russian life expectancy for men to drop by 6 years in a 3-year period. 85% of Russians lived in poverty in the year 1992, which Boris Yeltsin was able to later bring down to a pretty impressive 35%. So, again, only 1 in 3 people now living in poverty. So great. This all happened, again, during peacetime. They were not fighting anyone. The Cold War, which, when they were in kind of a constant economic assault and sabotage and, they were trying to do the same thing back to America, that period had ended. It was supposed to be a all, unencumbered, flourishing. I just kind of combined blossom and flourish there. That's my bad. Just a really kind of blossom, a flourishing, an expansion of the free market. Everything was supposed to be perfect, but again, with no kind of external forces, external limits on that, And Yeltsin, the best he could do was more than 1 in 3 people living in poverty. And to sign of peak capitalism, though, a new market was opening up. And that was the market for family heirlooms and personal belongings that people had to put on sale in order to survive, which Jeffrey Sachs, who kind of led this process at the time for Clinton, characterized as spontaneous market activity. That's good to see. That's how you know capitalism is really working, when people are selling off their most treasured heirlooms to put food on the table, I have to say. We talked a lot about an individual level, but coming up, we'll talk about what happened on the market level with the companies. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for listening and supporting Newsflash. We now have a brand new way for you to be heard if you want, whether a text message or a audio message. Please, no video messages. I really just do not think that's necessary. We have a new feedback box open for you. Ladies and gentlemen, it is officially open. SWRN702@gmail.com. Send a text message, send a voice message of no more than 30 seconds via the voice memos function. Either of those two options, and we will 100%, not going to find this guarantee anywhere else. We're going to play it on the show, listen to what you have to say, and it literally could be about anything. Well, if it's inappropriate, we won't play it, but it could be about anything. Thank you so much. This is my thank you to all the listeners who have stuck out with us and want to have their own voice in the show. SWRN702@gmail.com is the address. In 1991, Western capitalists had practically dollar signs in their eyes at the site of what was, at the time, the second largest economy, obviously behind the United States, that was ripe for the privatization. It was going to be divvied up and exposed to the world market with international investment, a really, really big deal. 90,000 companies were privatized within the first few years. And they could finally offer Russian people a great chance to purchase stock in a company. Because, again, not only were they obviously excited about international investment, selling these companies off, and investing them, and just kind of making them, quote unquote, more valuable. Again, more valuable to the capitalist. They were obviously just as thrilled to give ordinary Russians a chance to know what it means to be a stockholder and participate in a capitalist economy. So what they did is set up a system where people could be auctioned off, or companies, could be auctioned off to people in the form of shares, and there was public auctions put up, and it was all great. Right. Oh, yeah. We just spent the past 15 minutes talking about how almost every single working class Russian, or just poor, or middle class Russian, any kind of Russian that was not really near the top or at the top of the economic food chain, was completely decimated by the end of the Soviet Union, and especially in those first few years. So they offered vouchers to purchase shares that were spent on food, which, because they were starving, they spent on food instead of just, purchasing a share in a company, which is just kind of ridiculous for them. Probably. You just imagine you're some Russian who's lived in the Soviet Union all your life. Goods are up 250%. You laid off your job, and you get this voucher. Oh, do you want to buy a stock, or do you want to buy some bread? Or buy a pizza from Pizza Hut now that you can do with your great brand new freedom under capitalism. Well, I think they chose the bread. At the end of the day, which I have to say makes some sense. In the end, 14% of companies privatized were actually available for public auction or purchase, in kind of the form of a IPO, I guess you could say, of the sorts. And most went to the company insiders who took control due to inside connections and began to rapidly concentrate their wealth at the top, rivaling some inequality that we saw in America at the time. So another side, they were truly becoming capitalists. Wealth was accumulating exactly where it should. Today, we know these lucky business owners who immediately profited massively from receiving huge chunks of the formerly state-owned economy by a different name, Russian oligarchs. Oh, and by the way, also incredibly popular and influential during this time of economic destitution for the vast majority of people and a bunch of wealth being concentrated at the top, mass unemployment, mass inflation, mass inability to buy products, organized crime. This period was pretty much largely created or credited with the development of the Russian mafia. It's important to make some key contextual points. First, on privatization, even if it had been slower, we would still see a lot of the same wealth be concentrated at the top because that's just what happens in a capitalist system by nature. With the Soviets, it was dramatic, it was fast, and it was quick, which really made it feel that much worse. But that inequality, that massive inequality in power and control, especially coming from a position of complete state ownership, was bound to happen no matter the speed of the privatization. Another thing is it was intentional. This process was intentionally corrupt and without regard for Russian people's living conditions by design from Western advisors. Again, top economist in the plan, Jeffrey Sachs, then of Harvard University, admitted in 1993 that, quote, as early advisors in the privatization process, we argued for speed above perfection in the distribution of shares. For the general success of the reforms, which were extremely precarious at the start, it was important to make facts by establishing widespread private property rights. Insider representation is a cost that should be accepted. Essentially, they knew that they were screwing over everyday Russians, but wanted to do it quickly before they realized how much they were being screwed and got pissed enough to do something about it. The privatization process continued apace and was backed up by the IMF abroad and Boris Yeltsin internally. The IMF released recommendations about restructuring, and they refused to provide crucial funds until those changes were made. These restructuring changes essentially amounted to the complete and total gutting of the economy and selling it for parts to some of the best connected men in Russia. They essentially held the entire economy hostage against the will of the people, as again, Boris Yeltsin had something around an 8% approval rating for a lot of the early part of his reign. It was heavily supported, though, of course, by the U.S. Yeltsin rapidly also consolidated power by executive orders and constitutional changes and emergency provisions to go around Parliament. Parliament, though, which was definitely filled with way more, Soviet holdovers, was actually democratic elected, and people, were kind of getting the sense that this shock therapy thing may not have been a good idea, so they were not so happy with that, to say the least. This is how Yeltsin responded to some of those angered words and angered actions by the parliament. This is how he responded.
Russia in the middle of a constitutional crisis when the president, Boris Yeltsin, ordered the army to shell Moscow's White House, the building housing parliament, on October 4th, 1993. At the instigation of defiant lawmakers, Moscow had just witnessed the deadliest street fighting since the revolution of 1917. In the end, the immediate crisis was resolved with the use of military force.
This wasn't a democratic transition to a sunny, capitalist world run by a natural market, the invisible hand determining market prices, everything being fair and equal and lovey-dovey. No, this was a violent imposition of a new order by force. And the violence, by the way, didn't just come in tanks, as it did that day on October 4th, 1993. It came, obviously, in the form of privatization and sanctions, in inflation and food prices and all that kind of stuff. The press, meanwhile, just like the rest of the economy, was privatized and completely in the tank for Yeltsin. We started the transition drastically unpopular and ended up winning presidential re-election due to favorable coverage and even more favorable ballot stuffing, allegedly. This forcing of Yeltsin down the throat of the Russians was the final nail in the coffin for any hope of a democratic transition. By now, it became pretty clear. The crushing of labor and parliamentary power and the consolidation of all state power around one single person, Yeltsin or Putin, was essential for the reforms to work because it would drastically reduce any form or vessel of internal resistance that could come. We saw, these Moscow defiant lawmakers who were really reflecting the mood of the public clearly when it came, when the idea of shock therapy was being discussed. They were the democratic ones in the situation. And everyone knew this at the time and still do. They knew that they had to be stopped. The West knew that they had to be stopped in order for these reforms to work. Democracy in its American Western form just could not be allowed to flourish, at least yet, and as we can see, still today. Sachs himself, Jeffrey Sachs, said the privatization of their economy required, quote, a disenfranchisement of the Workers' Council, which at that time was the only voice they had in a society becoming rapidly unequal. The only voice left in the discussion then of Russia's government, both in economic and the governmental spheres, were the Western capitalists. Russians themselves, both working and middle class, and pretty much everyone that, as I said before, was not either near or on the top of the economic food chain, was frozen out, made completely voiceless. The sham elections and oligarchic rule we know Russia for today was created by the IMF and Harvard economists. Democracy was never the means or the end of the transition. Private ownership and profit was. We see the consequences of an undemocratic Russian society manifested by its paranoid, repressive rulers and an unstable economy reduced to a petrostate by Western competitors that felt vulnerable and detached enough to invade Ukraine. Obviously, that's the Russians, not the Western competitors, to be 100% clear. When we look at Russia today, we need to reflect that our policy of killing democracy, for example, mass privatization, making men billionaires by appointment and connection, and the mass suffering that it caused made a country a powerfully malevolent force, isolating it from the world stage and eventually leading to the catastrophic loss of Ukrainian life. We can only hope that these mistakes will be considered at the end of the war, but if prior history indicates future performance, the outlook isn't good. We'll see, essentially. That's all the time we have for today. It's been Hidden History. Thank you so much for listening. We'll be back next week with more from this period of the world and the formation of our world today through stories that are not often told, but I hope you'll agree, need to be.